Hello, welcome to Sacerdotus Hangouts. On today's broadcast or show, or whatever it is you want to call it, I'm going to speak on the atheist claim that there's no evidence for God. And since there's no evidence for God, there's no God. So, no evidence for God, therefore, no God. Atheists often rely on this appeal to ignorance fallacy. No evidence for God, therefore, there is no God. To settle any discussion with theists regarding the existence of God. Now, at first glance, this whole idea, this whole argument seems to make sense. It seems to settle the matter, right? If it's not there, then it's not there, right? If something's not there, if somebody tells me there's a pink elephant flying somewhere and I look and it's not there, then it's not there, right? Well, let's examine this whole thing closely. First, how do we know that something does not exist? In order to truly know for certain, one must be omniscient. That is to say, one must know about everything in reality, everything of the universe, everything of everything, in order to make that conclusion. And that's something that we cannot do. Nobody can do that. Make such conclusions on the existence of anything. It's just impossible. We could say things based on our senses, but we cannot truly verify that statement in regards to something that does not exist. So, again, this whole thing is impossible for a human being. We are barely scratching the surface, so to speak, on this physical universe with the science of physics, astronomy, astrophysics. We are barely scratching the surface on what this universe is, where it comes from, what's keeping it stable, what's keeping it in existence, why does it exist. We're still scratching bits and pieces off of those questions. And many times, the more we discover, the more things just don't make sense. Just like recently, a supermassive black hole was discovered. Many times, the mass of our own sun, a black hole. Now that's huge. If it's way bigger than our sun, than our star, that's a big black hole. And you can imagine the amount of gravitational pull that it has. And this black hole apparently has been around nearly since the time of the Big Bang, shortly after the period of Planck time. And physicists, astrophysicists, astronomers are all baffled of this black hole. Why does it exist? Why it's so huge? And so forth. So we're barely scratching the surface on anything in regards to this universe and how it works. And we discover things almost every day, every week, every month that it's just baffling and it makes us question our own ideas and established facts in regards to the universe and so forth. The more we look at a subatomic particles, bosons, mesons, quarks, gluons, and so forth, the more this universe does not make sense, at least in a materialistic sense. And with the discovery of the Higgs boson about a year or 2 years ago, is even opening up more questions as to how this universe exists, why it exists, why it exists in the way that it does. Why did it form us in the way that it did? Why didn't we form or evolve differently? Why did gravity form and operates in the way that it does? For example, with planets and stars, why are they spherical in shape? And of course, it's because of the gravitational, the mass within the planet of the star. The gravity within the mass, the larger it is, the more gravity, and it's pulling within himself. So it creates that spherical image. But why? Why doesn't it create a triangular image or a rectangular image? Why does gravity pull things in such a way that it creates an image of a sphere around planet, around spherical sun, star, and so forth? The moon, even though it has craters and whatnot, is still a sphere, is round. Why, when we look up, it's not a trapezoid? Why does gravity pull things in that manner that everything becomes spherical? So there's a lot in science that we still are grasping and trying to understand and try to piece together. So the claims that we could just know things exist and don't exist, we can't really say for certain that things do not exist or do exist. Now, with the existence, we could do that better because we could actually perceive it. But as far as things that do not exist or appear not to exist, then that's very difficult to confirm because we're limited to five senses. Now, some people may say, well, we have technology, we have all these different gadgets and whatnot that test things, and the computers analyze the evidence and so forth. But while these computers and these things don't have senses like we do, they imitate our senses. Telescopes can see, sometimes even better than the human eye, but still it mimics the human eye. It mimics the sense of vision. And because of that, is limited, just like our own senses are limited. Then when you put all that together, this data that we get from these devices, these instruments, are subject to our own senses. So we cannot really confirm it because they still have to go through our process, our physical process of processing things via the senses. And a good example is yesterday there was a big commotion, and even till now, it's trending on all different social media about this dress that some people see it as gold and white, or some people see it as black and blue. Some people see it as blue and gold, and everybody's debating amongst each other, saying that they see it in different colors, different patterns. And this is an example to show the problems of the senses, that we cannot truly rely on them. We cannot say for certain that what we perceive is actually what we perceive. Naturally, we have to trust it, otherwise we will go crazy. But we cannot say that what we receive from our senses are 100% accurate. And many times they're not. This is why when there's an accident, and let's say there's an accident in an intersection, and there's people on four corners that observed the accident, and the police come and they start interrogating everybody. The detectives, the officers there present, are going to have four or more different versions of the accident. Two cars colliding, and you're going to get four or more different accounts of that. And that's because the human brain processes all this stimuli via the senses. And depending on the grade of health that your senses operate on, you're going to get good or limited or bad information going to your brain. Then when it goes to the brain, it goes through all these different processes. The brain starts comparing it to other accidents that you may have witnessed or saw on TV. He starts comparing it to the very concept of accident. And it starts applying all these different things that we already have stored in our brain. And sometimes what happens is we create false memories, false things that really didn't happen. That it's just our brain pieced all these things together, that in the process it confused itself and it tainted the information that we got from the senses. Then we have the whole thing of what's called representativeness heuristics, which is basically the brain loves to make shortcuts. It pieces information together and it comes to a quick conclusion without really thinking things through. And so we can't, when atheists say that there's no evidence for God and they say, show me some evidence, falsifiable evidence, I laugh at that because we really don't have solid evidence for anything at all. We just trust what we perceive and what we put together via our fields of knowledge, science, and so forth. We just trust it. And these are all based on human constructions. We trust these facts to be true because, unfortunately, we are limited to our five senses. And with science, it's very interesting because we can observe different things and we can apply different theories or hypotheses to them. And this is where psychology also becomes an issue with science. Because many times we may have the data or the evidence gathered, but the scientist's mind, the way he or she processes that information, can become tainted by his or her own bias. And we see that with scientists who are vocal in their atheism, such as Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss, who go around in the name of atheism claiming that science is somehow the banner, the torch of atheism. And Dawkins, who's a biologist by training, will often bring up evolution as a way to show that there's no need for a God. Everything is part of natural random processes that happen to come together perfectly to form different types of life. And he concludes that because of this, there's no need for a creator or a God or anything out there that started that process and continues that process. The same with Lawrence Krauss, who's a cosmologist, a physicist, and he starts using the theory of cosmic inflation and all these other theories, string theory, M theory, and whatnot, and comes to the conclusion that these things, these happenings, do not need a creator, a trigger, a conscious being, an intelligence, whatever you want to call it, a prime mover. And this is where the bias comes in, because science does not say that. Nowhere in science are you going to see a statement that says God did not do it. Nowhere. Because that would be bad science. You're putting an inference on it, on the research, on the data. You're putting your own inferences, your own bias on the information, on the data, which the data and information do not state that. Just because evolution occurs and the Big Bang occurred or cosmic inflation does not mean there is no God. That inference comes from so and so atheist scientist who is perverting these theories, these scientific facts, in order to push the atheistic agenda. Now, second, evidence can be anything. And we see this in courts of law where both parties, the plaintiff and the defendant, go at all lengths to prove their case. You remember the O.J. Simpson trial back in the early 90s when I was extremely young, and what's his name, Johnny Cochran, put on the glove and said, if it doesn't fit, you can't acquit. And when, or however the phrase goes, I can't remember it verbatim, but they use all kinds of arguments in order to make their case and provide all kinds of evidence. And in order to give the evidence weight, they argue for the evidence. They present a case using the evidence. Now, the opposition can do the same thing with the same evidence. They can take the same evidence and paint a whole different picture in order to convince the jury and the judge of their side, of their position, by using the same evidence that the other side used. So evidence can be anything. And does a historian need to produce the living corpse of George Washington to prove he existed? Or are the written accounts of his life enough? Now think about that. We were all told in school that George Washington was this general and he lived in Virginia. And he crossed the Delaware River in the cold, and that he refused to be crowned the king. And at one time, while he was on a horse, a small boy on a tree tried to lower a, a branch on his head of leaves to try to crown him king of America. And he moved out of the way in order to avoid getting crowned. We hear all these different stories. Yet he's not here. We see images not of him, but of a painting of him on the dollar bill, on the quarter. In Washington, we see monuments of statues, images of this man. But at the time, there was no photography. We don't have a picture of him. There was no Kodak or Fuji or Canon or Samsung around that anybody could use to take pictures. There was no Instagram, Twitter, Facebook where people can upload these pictures. Hey, this is George Washington. All we have are an artist's interpretation of this man, of this general, this military leader. And all we have are documents written of him and some things written by him, which we are told were written by him. Yeah, there's no real way to tell if any of this was actually written by him and if any of the things written of him are actually accurate. What if somebody made it up? Now, does a historian, a history teacher, does he or she have to resurrect the corpse of George Washington in order to prove to the class or to a audience of academics that George Washington was in fact a real living person that existed over 200 years ago? And the answer is no, of course not. Because we have the written accounts of this man. We have this type of evidence. The same thing was Paine, who was a British citizen and always was in America. He was hated in England because he was very outspoken. He didn't like the idea of a king. He was very anti-monarchy, and he wrote many pamphlets. And at the time, pamphlets were like blogs. Today we have blogs. People go on blogs and they write different things. People go on Facebook and they put all kinds of status updates. Well, back in the days, they didn't have all that. What the people did was they wrote pamphlets. And these pamphlets compose all different types of ideas and stories, poems, whatever anybody thought at the time. And if you were educated enough to write and know how to write and know how to express yourself, you could write about anything. So Thomas Paine, he wrote different pamphlets, and mind you, he only got up to the about the sixth grade education, if my memory serves me well. That's how far he got in school, the sixth grade. So, despite today people calling him an intellectual and whatnot, he was really not well educated by today's standards. But he was a great thinker, and many attribute the American Revolution and the whole idea of independence to Thomas Paine, especially with his pamphlet Common Sense, where he wrote and people bought it. It was selling like hotcakes, so to speak, and people were inspired. Americans were inspired by this Common Sense pamphlet where he makes all these different arguments against the idea of having a king and the idea of self-governing and so forth. So the Americans were happy. And then, of course, with the way the British were treating them, taxing them for any little thing, for stamps and whatnot, that aroused them even more to go against the monarchy. And lo and behold, we have the American Revolution, and now we have the United States, which is now the superpower of the world. And Britain is now somewhere in fifth or sixth place in the world, where years ago, Britain was the superpower and number one and whatnot. And now this little country, America, which began with 13 colonies and now has 50 states and is the most powerful nation in the world. And it many times takes the lead in the world. And all of this, many attribute to Thomas Paine, who inspired the early Americans with his pamphlet. And not to mention later on, he wrote Age of Reason, which he goes on making all kinds of crazy ideas, which were in existence at a time when people were questioning religion and whatnot. And what would happen is that people would sit in the coffee shops and talk about these things, about religion and myths, and they will argue amongst each other and whatnot. And Thomas Paine will hang out with these people, and he will pick up these ideas, and that's where he came out with Age of Reason. But even Thomas Paine, what happened was that his body, when he died, people hated him so much they wanted to destroy his body, and they actually succeeded. His body was stolen, and it is believed that some of his bones were used for buttons to make buttons for shirts. And to this day, we don't have a corpse of him. We don't have any remains. We have the tomb, the headstone, but we don't have any actual bones or anything left of him, any remains, because they were stolen and possibly completely destroyed. Now, can anyone say, okay, Thomas Paine never existed because we don't have a body of him, or we have our pamphlets of him, things that he supposedly written, that we're told that he written, that he wrote. And do you see the point that I'm trying to make? Is that we do not have to provide the actual thing, the actual person, in order to prove that the actual thing or person exists. We don't need to provide a living George Washington or Thomas Paine and then ask them to write for us, to make sure that the writings that we attribute to them or actually written by them. We don't have to do all that in order to prove that these individuals existed, because we have the evidence, their writings, the accounts of them, not to mention the effect of their lives. We have the United States of America, because George Washington was a great general. He knew how to organize troops. He knew how to get the Continental Army together and fight against the British. We know Thomas Paine existed because of the writings, because of the way he inspired the Americans, and because there's records of him in France and Great Britain. So we don't need to have their corpses reanimated. We don't need to develop a Back to the Future car with Marty McFly and Doc Brown to go back to time through time and see these individuals in order to confirm they existed. So it's laughable, it's funny when atheists say, "Show me God, show me evidence for God," and then when you give them arguments, or you use nature, or you use the historicity of Jesus Christ, they want to dismiss it. Yeah, they quickly accept George Washington, Thomas Paine, and so forth. It's absurd, and you could see that atheists are just putting up a mental block, a mental filter. They don't want to listen to the evidence. And that's called the fallacy of a priorism. When you refuse to hear your opponent's evidence or side and you quickly dismiss it, that's the fallacy of a priorism. And again, just because you do that doesn't mean you're right. Just because you say that you don't believe somebody's evidence or somebody's evidence is not valid doesn't make it invalid. If I was to say that George Washington never existed or Thomas Paine never existed, and I dismiss all their writings, I say Asia, Reason, Common Sense were not written by Thomas Paine. They were written by Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson. Suppose I say that. Just because I say it doesn't mean it's true. Because again, the evidence speaks for itself. You got to let the evidence speak. You can't infer on the evidence. And another good example is the great Western philosophy, the father. Some people call him the father of philosophy, but I disagree with that because the philosophy existed way before the Greeks in other parts of the world, in Africa and whatnot. But that's a whole different hangout show. But for now, let's just call him the father of Western philosophy, Socrates. He never wrote anything down. The man needs to go gather young people in different squares and arenas and talk to them, ask questions, use the Socratic method, asking questions until he broke down the argument that the youth or whoever he was arguing with was using. And he never wrote anything down. So, how do we know about Socrates? Well, another philosopher, Plato, wrote about Socrates and wrote his thoughts and thought experiments, his philosophies, his ideas. Plato wrote them down. That's what we know of Socrates. Socrates never wrote anything down. Yet we all teach in schools that he was a real person, that he existed, he walked the earth and did exactly everything that I described. He went out into the courts, into the streets of Greece, and debated with people and argued and asked questions. We will trust that this information we are told of Socrates is true, is valid. And I know of no atheist that will say that Socrates never existed. Yet they're quick to say that Jesus Christ never existed because the Gospels were written 100, 200 years after the resurrection, crucifixion, and life and miracle workings of Jesus Christ. The atheist is quick to dismiss Jesus Christ as non existent, a myth, because of that sole reason. Because there was nobody videotaping him as he was walking around healing people. Because today we haven't really found anything that was written around the time he was alive or died or resurrected. Or we have other witness accounts that were written 70, 100 years after. Until recently, where they found the Gospel of Mark, a piece of it, in a Egyptian mask, which dates to the first century. So obviously there are documents out there that are older. We just haven't found them yet. But the atheist makes the argument, says that Jesus Christ is a myth because these documents, these gospels were written way after. Yet when you ask them, is Socrates real? They say yes. Yet we don't have anything written from him. We know him from Plato, somebody that wrote of him. Now, Dr. Seuss wrote about the cat in the hat. Does that mean the cat in the hat is real? Do you see where I'm going with this? The bias that atheists have when it comes to God and Jesus Christ, where they're quickly willing to accept the the historicity of Socrates, who never wrote anything down, just like Jesus Christ. To our knowledge, Jesus Christ never wrote anything down. The only thing we know that he wrote something on the ground, which is mentioned in the gospel, but we don't know what. And obviously, we can't find that ground. And obviously, due to weathering, that whatever he wrote is not going to be there. But that's the only thing we know that he wrote something on the ground. But as far as sitting down with papyrus and writing, to our knowledge, he did not do that unless we find something now or in the near future. But as it stands, Jesus Christ never wrote down anything. He never sat down and wrote the gospel. He never sat down and said, okay, today I was born of a virgin, and then I did this, then I healed this blind person. He never did that. Well, guess what? Socrates never either. Socrates never wrote anything. We know him because of Plato. Yet the atheist accepts the existence, the historicity of Socrates, who we only know about via Plato, but yet rejects Jesus Christ. Now try to make sense of that. Third, the human being's senses, perception, and cognitive abilities are extremely limited. And I mentioned this in the beginning of the program, how limited the senses are and the processing abilities of the human brain. The brain compensates a lot when processing stimuli, so it does not always give an accurate account of what we call reality. And many times, the brain, for lack of a better word, lies to us. And a good way of showing this is you take your index finger and you touch the tip of your nose. Now, when you do that, your fingertip feels the skin of your nose, and the skin of your nose feels the skin of your fingertip, right? And you feel that in real time because you're doing it at the same time in real time. Is it really happening in real time? Well, visually, yes, it is happening in real time. But sensory speaking, it's not. You're not actually touching it at the same time. And the reason why is because the nerves from the nose to the brain have a shorter distance for the stimuli to travel as opposed to the finger tip of the index finger. It takes longer for the signal, the stimuli from the fingertip to go up the arm, the forearm, the elbow, the upper arm, the shoulder, all the way up to the spinal cord, to your brain. It takes much longer. So there's a time difference there of the signal reaching your brain. Yet your brain, our brains tell us that we're touching at the same time. We're sensing the nose and the finger at the same time, where in reality, it's not. There's a delay because of the distance. The nose is closer to the brain than the index finger. And this is a way that the brain compensates. Because if the brain didn't do this, we would be crazy on Earth. We would be out of control, trying to figure out what's going on, when it's going on, how is it going on. We will go crazy, absolutely nuts, trying to sort all these all the stimulus that the world gives us. We will go absolutely crazy. The brain will go into catatonic shock, trying to figure out all these different senses. So what it does, it compensates, it makes up, it lies a little bit. for lack of a better term. So, what's reality is really subject to what the brain wants to tell us what reality is. There can be somebody standing in front of us who exists in a different dimension that we don't know about, that we don't have the sensory capability to perceive. And that's touches a bit on M theory or string theory, which poses that there's 12 dimensions. And in these 12 dimensions, there's different realities going on. And we're only capable of perceiving our own dimension, our own reality. And if string theory proves to be true, then there are things out there in different states of reality, different realities that exist, but we cannot perceive them. So that's a whole another other mind-boggling thing that I could get into, and it would just give you a brain headache, like it does with every science student, philosophy student, and whatnot. So just because we might not be able to see, hear, taste, smell, or feel God does not mean God does not exist. Now, how could you prove this? How can you explain this better? Or how can I explain this better? Well, let me explain it using a historical figure in American history. I'm sure you have heard of Helen Keller. Helen Keller was a well known figure in American history. Keller was born blind, deaf, and mute. Now imagine that. We know people that are blind, we know people that are mute, we know people that are deaf. Imagine having all of these, not being able to see, speak, or hear. Can you imagine that existence? The only thing you could do is feel. That's the only thing you could do. Can't see anything. You can't hear anything. You cannot visualize anything with your eyes. These senses are completely turned off. And because you cannot hear anything, you obviously can't speak because you need your ears to learn words, to learn speech, and process that speech. We all rely heavily on our senses, in particular hearing and sight. And we could do this at home with an experiment. Close your eyes and try to walk in place. And keep walking in place and keep your eyes closed. If you open your eyes, you probably notice that you probably moved from your original location, despite you not actually trying to make the effort to steer yourself to another location. And this is because we're so intertwined with the world via our senses that we rely on them heavily. We need our eyes in order to coordinate where we are. And when our vision is shut off, the brain gets disoriented. So it doesn't know where to go. It's almost like a drunk person can't coordinate. So imagine living without them. Imagine living without vision, without hearing, without these senses. It will be a crazy existence. It will be a scary existence. And in Keller's case, unless you are touched, you will not have any awareness that something or someone is near you. Keller experienced this. She cannot see, she cannot hear. The only way she knew somebody was around her was if somebody touched her or she felt a vibration or the person smelled, had a body odor or some kind of perfume or cologne. That's the only way she would know that there was somebody around. Now, suppose you had this condition. You cannot see or hear, and 10 people encircle you without touching you. And at the same time, they avoid making any vibrations that your sense of touch might pick up. So put yourself in that and close your mind and try to visualize that. You're somewhere and there's 10 people around you, and you don't have your sense of sight and your sense of hearing. And these people are around you, 10 people, and they're absolutely still, and they're encircling you. And because they're still, they're not making any vibration, so you cannot pick it up via your sense of touch. Now, will you be aware of these 10 people? Will you have quote unquote empirical evidence of their presence? The answer is no. You will be completely oblivious to their existence due to the absence of two of your most important senses, sight and hearing. But the evidence is there. There are 10 people encircling you. The problem is that you cannot sense them by normative means, hearing and vision. Now, just because you lack this ability to sense them does not mean the 10 people are not there. So, just because Helen Keller wasn't able to see people or hear people that were nearby her does not mean the people were not there just because she couldn't perceive them. So, God is the same. He is around us. We might not sense His presence as we would another human being, animal, or object unless He wills it. Nonetheless, He is there. He is there present. Our perceptual limits are quote unquote the problem of why we can truly perceive God, just like you perceive your mother, your father, your children, your sisters, your brothers, co-workers, boss, or whoever. Because our senses work only for this natural world, not for the supernatural world, not for the spiritual world, not for the metaphysical world. So our perceptual limitations are not the final word on what exists and does not exist. So we cannot say that something does not exist or exists solely based on the senses. Because again, the senses could give us all kinds of information. The brain can do whatever it wants with that information, and many times it gets it wrong. And there might be things out there that we just cannot perceive because our senses are not equipped to perceive them. They were not designed to perceive them. They did not evolve to perceive them. And an example is carbon monoxide, the deadly gas that kills quickly. It's odorless, it's tasteless. It obviously doesn't make a sound. Yet it's there, it can be there, God forbid, and it will kill you. Now, just because your senses can pick them up doesn't mean carbon monoxide cannot be there or it's not there. So the atheist is wrong when he or she comes to the conclusion that, okay, I don't see God, I don't see this man with a beard sitting over the earth. I don't hear him when I pray. When I pray, I don't hear anybody talking back to me. Or I don't sense his presence walking near me or carrying me or whatnot. That means he's not there. The atheist cannot say that. Making that argument is an appeal to ignorance because you cannot know that. Absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence, to quote from Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer. So when the atheists come and argue and say there's an evidence for God, therefore God is not real, that's a big appeal to ignorance because they cannot know that. There's no way anyone can know that. And speaking of Carl Sagan, he had a great response that he gave in an interview. And he said, quote, "An atheist is someone who is certain that God does not exist, someone who has compelling evidence against the existence of God. I know of no such compelling evidence, because God can be relegated to remote times and places, and to ultimate causes. We will have to know a great deal more about the universe than we do now to be sure that no such God exists. End quote. It's a very powerful words coming from Carl Sagan. He says it clearly that an atheist making the claim that God does not exist is really irrational because there's no such compelling evidence showing that. Why? Because God is relegated to remote times and places and ultimate causes. And in order for us to, or for the atheist to 100% disprove God or verify the claim that God does not exist, he or she will have to know everything about the universe to be sure that no such God exists, as Sagan puts it. And no one in this world has that qualification. No one. Neither Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, nor any atheist blogger out there, any atheist from American Atheists, or any atheist who broadcasts on Hangouts or on social media, or who have podcasts. None of them have the qualifications to say that he or she knows enough about the universe to rule out God, to say that no such God, no such a being exists. No one can say that. Therefore, the whole argument that God does not exist, there's no evidence for God and whatnot, is an appeal to ignorance. And the person making it is overstepping his or her ability, because nobody on earth has that knowledge in order to come to that conclusion. The real reason is that you don't want to accept the evidence for God. That's really the whole reason, is that you don't want to accept the evidence for God. Because there is evidence. And again, the evidence is not going to be a man sitting on a throne or a man bleeding on a crucifix shouting Eli Eli lama sabachthani, or a man walking on the water. That's not going to be the evidence, of course. Just like a historian cannot produce the living corpse of George Washington, Thomas Paine, or Socrates. All we have to rely on are witness accounts, writings of them, and their own writings. And the same thing with science. Let's take cosmic inflation, the Big Bang theory, which the theory comes from a Catholic priest, ironically. Atheists love to use this theory to say that God does not exist. Yet this theory came from a Catholic priest, a Catholic Monsignor, George Lemaitre. And he came up with these calculations using mathematics, showing that the universe began at a point, at a singularity, and it's expanding. Now, when the scientist makes a hypothesis or a theory, he or she has to provide evidence, data, to support that hypothesis or theory, or it will get dismissed. So the job of the scientist is to find the best theory or the evidence that fits the theory. That's the job of a scientist, is to find the facts, the information, the data that fits whatever theory or hypothesis he or she posted it. And with the cosmic inflation, naturally nobody can view that, because we would have to go back through time in order to view the Big Bang and cosmic inflation. And even the whole idea would be impossible. Even if we had a time machine, it would be impossible to go back in time to view the Big Bang. Suppose there was a time machine now and somebody wanted to go back through time and videotape the Big Bang as it happened, it would be impossible, even if we had time traveling technology. And the reason why is because time began at the Big Bang. So, how can you travel back in time when time did not exist? And remember your composition, your body, your existence, your atoms and molecules all work alongside time and space. We are all bound to space and time. We cannot step outside of space and time. We will cease to exist. We are part of this universe that operates on the laws of physics. It's almost like the movie The Matrix. The characters in the movie were part of this computer programming. And if they got unplugged, they died. So we cannot step outside this universe, this realm that we call the universe, because we're bound to the laws of the universe. We exist within the laws and the parameters of the universe because we're made of atoms and molecules and subatomic particles, all which obey and work with the laws of physics, which include space and time. So there's no way we can go back through time and record or take pictures of the Big Bang as it happened because we will disappear along the way. But how do we know the Big Bang happened? Where's the evidence? Well, we see it through what's called redshifting. And this is when the light waves move away from the galaxies or move out of the galaxies as the galaxies are moving and expanding. And this shows us that the universe is, in fact, expanding. And you could think of it as a siren or a sound when a police car or ambulance has a siren on and it speeds right past you. You hear the sound distorting as it passes. Well, that's pretty much what redshifting is. We see the light waves as it moves, the distortion of it. And that's how we know that the universe is in fact expanding, that George Lemaitre was correct. And this is a case when the evidence fits the theory. It shows it. We don't need to go and videotape the Big Bang in order to prove that it happened. We see the circumstantial evidence of it. The same to evolution. We can't record evolution because it takes millions of years. We will be dead trying to record the whole process. Yeah, we know because of the genetics behind it, because of the fossil evidence, that there was a transition going on. The speciation was taking place. We know this via this circumstantial evidence. So when it comes to religious ideas or God or whatnot, what do philosophers and theologians use? Circumstantial evidence. They use nature, arguments via reason to present the evidence for God. And that's absolutely valid because guess what? Scientists do the same thing in regards to their own theories and hypotheses. They can't present to you a Big Bang in a laboratory or evolution in a laboratory. All they could do is present you the circumstantial evidence showing that this happened and is happening. So the whole idea that there's no evidence for God, therefore there's no God, is completely bunk. And hopefully in this episode, I was able to argue and show why the whole idea is bunk and doesn't make any sense. Again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And the whole argument that there's no evidence for God, God does not exist, there's no evidence, is a poor understanding of how science works, how epistemology works, And epistemology is the study of knowledge, of the methodology, of the procedure of acquiring knowledge. And what is knowledge exactly? And these forms of knowledge are come in different ways, and people argue for and against different forms of knowledge. For example, there's the a priori, which is said to be the knowledge that is independent of experience. It's knowledge that we possess that we didn't pick up via the senses. Then there's a posteriori, which is the knowledge that we get after the fact of getting experience via the senses. Then there's what's called rationalism, which is deciphering knowledge and truth, not solely on sensory, but on the intellect and deductive reasoning. Then there's constructivism, which is we make up the knowledge, human beings make up the knowledge. Then there's idealism, which poses that we get intuitions or this knowledge just comes to us. It's, it comes from a mental construction. And then there's empiricism, which poses that we get knowledge via the senses. That's how we learn. That's how we acquire knowledge. So we have all these different ideas, these different topic categories within the branch of epistemology. And these are all valid, in my opinion. You could argue for and against them. You could definitely argue for them. We definitely have pieces of each, in my opinion. And these are all valid forms of knowledge and input. So when atheists claim that there's no evidence for God, God does not exist, and so forth, they're just showing a lack of understanding of epistemology and how knowledge works and what is knowledge. And a good example in psychology would be introspection. Introspection is your own perception, how you feel about yourself, your awareness, your self-awareness of your thoughts, feelings, your mood, everything. And nobody can perceive that. You can go to a psychologist, a therapist, a social worker, a psychiatrist, but he or she will never study or measure your introspection. Only you are aware of that. No one can perceive your introspection. That's all part of your mind, your brain, your consciousness, your psychology. No one can interpret that, no one can measure it, yet it exists. So I cannot go around and say that your introspection doesn't exist just because I can't perceive it or I can't measure it, because it does. You have your introspection, I have mine. So you see the argument when atheists say that there's no evidence for God, therefore God doesn't exist, doesn't work. Because there's many things in this world that we cannot measure empirically, yet they do exist. And the human introspection is one of them. It's a perfect example of something that we cannot measure. We cannot put in a machine, in an MRI, and or CAT scan, or a microscope, or any device out there. We cannot put it in these devices and measure it and see people's examination of their own thoughts and feelings, their stasis, the consistency of their temperament. We cannot measure that, yet it exists. Guess what? It exists in every living human being, atheist, theist, agnostic, black, white, Hispanic, whatever race, ethnicity you are. We all have introspection. Even people with mental disabilities, people who are autistic, have Asperger's. If you are a living human being, you have introspection. But we can't prove it, at least via empirical means. We can't falsify it because there's no way to, but yet it exists. So hopefully that helps you understand better why the argument that there's no evidence for God, therefore there's no God doesn't work. And it's a complete ignorance of science, psychology, philosophy, and it's just mental sloth, intellectual sloth on the part of the atheist to conclude that there is no God based on no evidence or no empirical evidence or no falsifiable evidence. Because I give you many reasons why that's just doesn't work at all. You need to try better than that in order to make your case that God in fact does not exist. Because there's other things out there that you cannot measure, that you cannot falsify, that you cannot provide empirical evidence, yet exist. And you're using it right now, your introspection. Thank you for listening, everyone. God bless and Mary keep.